Hi, this is a new video on how to develop a game like Clash of Clans. So if you remember, in the previous video we set up a scene and we also created a grid. So to start, let me change this -45 to 45 and I'm just gonna adjust the position of the grid. So that's good enough. Now I think it's time to create some UI for our game. I'll start by creating a canvas, and an event system will be also created, and let's replace with input system. Now let's just create a bunch of text to show the amount of our resources. I'll just start by creating a text. I'll need to import some essentials of Text Mesh Pro. Here it is, our text. Let me actually go to the 2D mode. I'm gonna anchor this to top right. And this one is going to show the amount of gold that we have. I'm also going to rename this to text gold. And let's just create an empty game object and name it, let's say, main or anything else you want. I'm also gonna say this is gonna be full screen, so let's put all of this to 0 and also parent this text to this main. So I'm gonna duplicate this, name this elixir, and bring it down like this. Also, let me duplicate this and say this is also going to be the amount of our gems. Let's also create a button, and this is going to be button shop. Let's adjust the position, and I'm gonna anchor it to down right. So here we go. Let's just rename it to shop. Of course the UI needs to be looking better, it's just temporary, so anytime we can just disable and enable this main layout. Let's also create another folder in our scripts folder and name it UI. And inside of this UI folder, I am just going to create a script, and I'm just gonna name it UI main. So let's actually create another empty game object under our main game object and name this elements, and also make this full screen, and let's put these numbers to 0. I'm just gonna drag all of this under elements, so it's gonna be main elements, then anything inside of that. So we do not disable and enable this main, instead we enable and disable this elements, because we're going to attach this UI main to this main game object, and we don't want to disable a game object which this script is attached to. So instead of that, we're gonna disable and enable this whenever we want. So let's open up this UI main, and like usually I am going to create a namespace for it. And I'm going to create an instance for this UI main. So I'm gonna say private static UI main, and I'm just gonna say instance, and I'm gonna set it to null for now, and I'm also going to say public static UI main, and I'm name this one instance, and I'm gonna create a getter. So let's say whenever we want to get the value, we just say return underline instance, and here in our awake function we're just gonna assign the value of this instance. We're just gonna say instance equals to this. and we say using, because we're using Text Mesh Pro, so we say TM Pro, and here I'm gonna create a serialize field, and it's going to be a text, and it's going to be the UI element that is going to show the amount of our gold. We're going to create 2 more for our elixirs and gems, and we also need to add the listener of our button. So let me just copy this and also create a reference to our button. It's going to be shop button. I think we should use using Unity Engine.ui, and let's create the start method and also create a private method, and this is for shop button clicked. And here I'm just gonna say add a listener to the onClick event of our shop button. So let's actually make this text public because we want to change them from other scripts. So I'm just gonna put the public here, and I'm gonna go to my desktop in the project folder, and I'm gonna open my server project. So if you remember, in the server project we created a method to authenticate our players. But you should notice that this is not an efficient way to call a method on the server. We need to make this async method. Right now this is not an async method, and in event of multiple users calling this method, your server is going to freeze. So I'm just gonna copy this and I'm gonna paste it here. And this is going to be authenticate player async, and I'm just gonna make this private and also make it an async method. Now let's go to the function up here and clear the content, and also make this one async method. And here instead of void we're just gonna say task, and it's going to get an integer. And up here we need to say using system.threading.tasks. Now let's go back, and here I'm simply saying int account ID equals to await, and we're gonna call this function, and we're gonna pass the ID and device. And we could just simply remove this method, and instead of sending the response we're just gonna send it from our authentication method. Let's go up here, I'm just gonna paste this, and this is our account ID, and of course this is our client ID. We need to create a task for our authentication. I'm just gonna say task integer, and I'm just gonna name it task. And this is how we create a task. So this is gonna be an integer called account ID, and we're just gonna return that account ID in our task. So everything else here is going to inside the tasks. Let me just cut everything and paste it here. So now at the beginning of our tasks we're gonna create an account ID, which is an integer, and at the end of our tasks we're gonna return that account ID. And let's actually change the type to a long, because as you can see we are setting this account ID to a long. Let me also clear this functions and also remove the long at the start of the account IDs here and here, because we already defined it up here, and then we assign it within our functions, and we're just gonna return the result. And also let's change the type of this to long, the same thing here. And at the end of our function we're just gonna say return await for our task, and that should do it. Let's go up here, and instead of doing this, we're just gonna change this to long. So right now, as a response to authentication, we're sending a long back to the client. So now let's also start our local database. I'm just gonna go to my XAMPP folder, and I'm gonna open the control panel and start the services. And let's go to our database admin page. And if you remember, we created this database for our game. I'm just gonna go to the structure of my accounts table. Now let's go to the structure, and as you can see, there is an ID, device ID, and let's actually add another field. I'm just gonna name this gems. I'm just gonna create it here. Let's call it gems. And the default value, let's say 500, and that should do it. Now I'm gonna go back to my client. First of all, let's assign this UI elements, the first one, the second one, and this is the gems, this is the button. So as you can see here in the player script, whenever we receive a response from our server, it's a long indicating our account ID. But after we receive the account ID, which is the indication of a successful authentication, we want to send another request and ask the server to give us all the data about our account, like how many gems we have, how many golds we have, what kind of buildings and units we have. We want to get all of that data and apply it to our game. So we start small. We start by getting the resources first. To do that, let's go to the server and create a proper function for it. So we're gonna do something like this: authenticate player. So let's just copy this. Let's actually copy both of them. I'm just gonna copy them, and let's also collapse them to make room. I'll just paste it here, and let's rename this to sync player data. This is also going to be sync player data, and it's going to be async. So before we go any further, I like to create a class and use it to create data structures. So I'm gonna name this class data, and I'm just gonna create it as a public class, and I'm gonna create a class inside of this called player. So there is the player resources. And now, once we've created this data, let's actually make it a static as well. I'm just going to create two methods for serializing and deserializing data. So basically, what this serializing and deserializing doing, they're going to convert a class like this to a string. So we're gonna send the whole data as a string to the client and then deserialize it on our client. So let's create a public static string, and we're gonna pass a type of T. So we need an XML serializer, and this is going to be a capital X. So to make this work, we need to add using system XML serialization. So let's do that. And this is going to be new XML serializer, and it's going to be type of T. We also need a string writer, and to use a string writer we need to use system.io. So this is going to be a new string writer, and we're gonna say XML and serialize this using the writer, and this is going to be the target, and just at the end return writer.toString. So we're gonna create another method to deserialize our classes. So it's gonna be a public static of type T. The return type is going to be a T, and let's name it deserialize. And it's going to get a string. And let me just remove those signs because you don't need that. So to do this, we need an XML serializer just like that, and instead of a string writer we need a string reader. It is going to be reader, and we're just gonna return XML, and we're gonna deserialize it, the reader. And make sure when you create the reader, we're gonna pass the target, and that is going to create the reader. Then we're gonna deserialize the reader and return that. We also need to cast it by the type of T, and that should do it. And now we can go to the client side and create a script exactly like this with this content. Let's actually do that. I'm just gonna create a script called data. And now let's open this data, and I'm just gonna add the namespace first. And remove everything. And I'm just gonna copy the content of our data on the server to the data on our client. Of course, we also need to bring this using. So let me copy those two and bring it here. So here we go. We have a data script both on the server and the client with the same classes and two methods that can serialize and deserialize those classes. So let's go back to the server, and in the terminal, whenever the data is called, so here in the receive string and the case number 2, whenever this is going to be requested, it's a request to sync player data. So we simply say database dot sync player data, and we're just gonna pass the same values that we passed here, the client ID and the data, which is the device ID. So we're gonna just keep authenticating the player based on this device ID for now. Of course, later we need to change that to make it more secure, but for now let's just authenticate the player using this device ID. So now let's go to the database and check that out. Before that, let's actually go to the client. Here in the player script, whenever we receive the long, which is the account ID, we're not gonna only debug that, but we use sender, and we're gonna send TCP an ID of 2. The same thing here, we actually created a enum, let's say sync, and it's going to be ID of 2, the same ID we decided to choose on the server, a requests ID dot sync. We cast it to integer, and we're also going to send system info dot device unique identifier. That's it. Now let's go back to the server. Whenever the server receives that ID of 2 request, it's just gonna go to the database and sync player data. So here, instead of long, we say player, which is a data dot player. It's a class, so we're gonna say also this is going to be a data dot player, and this is going to be data. Let me just comment this for now, and this is also going to be data.player, and here is going to be data player, and I'm just gonna name it data equals to new data, and at the end we're just gonna return that data. So now we need to select the player, and we're gonna use the device ID just like we did in the authentication, but this time instead of just ID, we're also going to select the gold elixir and gems. And it must be found because we already authenticated the player, and that is the indication of an existing account for this device ID. So we don't need that found anymore. I'm just gonna clear that, and here I say data dot ID. Of course we didn't define any ID for it, but let's just comment this. I'm just gonna copy it. Let's say gold equals to gold, and it's going to be an integer parse. Let's also copy this and create two more. So basically this task is going to check the database, finds the player, gets the data of that player, and return it as a data.player class. And here, of course, instead of that, we need to use this function. Let me copy it and paste it. So sync player data async, we're gonna get that data and we wait until that data arrives, and meanwhile do the request of other players. So whenever we receive this data, we're gonna say a string dot, actually let's name this data and this one name it player. So this data is going to be data, which is the class data dot serialize. We're gonna serialize that, and the serialized type is going to be data dot player, and we're just gonna pass player. And this is going to convert our class, our player class, to a string, and we can just simply send that data using TCP send. We have the client ID, the request type, let's say for now it's 2, and this is going to be data, which is in a string. And of course we need to say sender.send. And we're gonna go back to the client, and we have a listener for received long. We need also to create a listener for received string, because the request we're sending from the server, the player data, is in a string. So we need to listen for incoming string packages. Let's say real-time networking on string received, and I'm just gonna plus equals to. Let's actually copy this and just use it for our string received a string, and of course the value type is going to be a string, and let's say the package value was 2 if you remember. For now let's just clear this. Received a string, I'm just gonna add the listener to this. We're gonna say data dot player equals to, and we'll name it player equals to data dot deserialize, and we're gonna pass the value. Of course we also need to say the type is data.player, and just like that, then we can use UI main to display those values. Let's actually do that. UI main dot instance, we are adding the listeners in the start, and here in the UI main we are assigning the instance in the await. So this is guaranteed that whenever we call this, it has a value, it's not null. So we're gonna just say gold dot text equals to player dot gold. Let's just say to a string. I'm just gonna copy this and paste it twice. And that should do it. Let's actually play the server. So the server has been started. I'm just gonna start the client. And as you can see, a connection has been established and we got the values for our resources. This is good enough for this video. If you had any questions, write a comment or even send me an email. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.